The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Ravenswood Hall with a persistence that matched the melancholy settling over the grand estate. Inside the opulent drawing room, where portraits of distinguished ancestors gazed down from gilded frames, the season's most eligible bachelor stood in brooding silence, his dark eyes fixed on the storm-lashed Yorkshire countryside beyond. Duke Julian Ravenswood, at 31, possessed the kind of commanding presence that made lesser men step aside, and debutantes flutter their fans with nervous excitement. Tall and broad-shouldered, with raven-black hair and eyes the color of midnight, he carried himself with the natural authority of a man born to rule vast estates and influence the fate of nations. Yet for all his wealth, title, and undeniable attractiveness, Julian remained stubbornly, deliberately unmarried, a source of endless speculation and frustration among the marriage-minded mothers of the ton. "Your Grace," came the tentative voice of his secretary, Mr. Pemberton, from the doorway. "Lady Pembroke's carriage has arrived. The family is here for tea, as arranged." Julian suppressed a sigh. Lady Pembroke, his godmother, and one of society's most formidable matrons, had been orchestrating these casual visits for months now, each one featuring a different, eligible young lady of impeccable breeding and substantial dowry. Today's offering was Miss Arabella Pembroke, her own niece, a diamond of the first water with golden ringlets, porcelain skin, and a laugh that tinkled like silver bells. "Very well, Pemberton. Show them to the blue drawing room. I shall join them presently." As his secretary withdrew, Julian straightened his cravat and prepared to endure another afternoon of polite conversation, veiled matrimonial hints, and the increasingly desperate machinations of a woman determined to see him settled before his next birthday. He had long since resigned himself to the necessity of marriage. His title demanded an heir, and his estates required the stability that came with a suitable duchess. The problem lay not in accepting his duty, but in finding a woman who stirred something more than polite indifference in his jaded heart. The blue drawing room was awash with afternoon light when Julian entered, the storm having temporarily abated to allow pale sunshine to stream through the tall windows. Lady Pembroke, resplendent in burgundy silk and enough jewels to fund a small army, rose from her chair with the practiced grace of a woman who had been commanding drawing rooms for 40 years. "Julian, darling," she exclaimed, extending her gloved hand for him to kiss. "How wonderful to see you looking so well. You remember my dear niece Arabella, of course, and her charming companion, Miss Moore." Julian's gaze moved first to Miss Arabella Pembroke, who curtsied with practiced perfection, her blue eyes sparkling with the confidence of a young woman who had never doubted her own appeal. She was, he had to admit, everything a duke could want in a wife: beautiful, accomplished, well-connected, and possessed of that particular brand of vivacious charm that made her the center of attention at every social gathering. But it was the second young woman who caught and held his attention, though she seemed to be doing everything in her power to remain invisible. Miss Lillian Moore stood slightly behind her more illustrious companion, her head bowed in a way that suggested a lifetime of practiced self-effacement. Where Arabella gleamed like a perfectly cut diamond, Lillian possessed the subtle beauty of a pearl, luminous but understated, requiring a discerning eye to appreciate its true worth. Her hair, a rich chestnut brown with hints of gold where the light touched it, was arranged in a simple style that emphasized the elegant line of her neck. Her dress, while well made, was clearly not of the first fashion, its modest cut and muted green color designed to complement rather than compete with her companion's more vibrant attire. What struck Julian most forcefully, however, were her eyes, a remarkable shade of violet blue that seemed to hold depths of intelligence and sensitivity that her demure demeanor couldn't quite conceal. When she curtsied, her movements possessed a natural grace that no amount of deportment lessons could teach, and when she murmured her greeting, her voice carried a musical quality that made him want to hear more. "Your Grace," Lillian said softly, her gaze fixed somewhere in the vicinity of his cravat, rather than meeting his eyes directly. "Thank you for receiving us in your beautiful home." "The pleasure is entirely mine," Julian replied, surprised by the genuine warmth in his own voice. There was something about her quiet courtesy, her obvious discomfort with being the center of attention, that stirred an unexpected protectiveness in him. As they settled into their chairs for tea, Julian found himself studying the dynamics between the two young women with growing fascination. Arabella, as expected, dominated the conversation with animated accounts of the season's most fashionable events, her laughter ringing out at regular intervals as she regaled them with gossip and observations. She was undeniably charming, her wit sharp and her manner engaging, yet Julian noticed how she seemed to expand in the spotlight, drawing attention to herself with the unconscious ease of someone who had never known what it was to be overlooked. Lillian, by contrast, remained largely silent, speaking only when directly addressed, and then with a thoughtfulness that suggested she weighed each word carefully before speaking. Yet Julian began to notice the subtle ways she supported her friend, how she would gently redirect conversation when Arabella's stories grew too scandalous, how she would offer quiet encouragement when her companion paused for breath, how her eyes would light with genuine pleasure at Arabella's triumphs, even as she remained firmly in the background. "And what of you, Miss Moore?" Julian asked during a brief lull in Arabella's recounting of Lady Worthington's disastrous musicale. "Have you been enjoying the season?" The question seemed to catch Lillian off guard. A delicate flush colored her cheeks as she glanced quickly at Arabella before answering. Yes, Your Grace, it has been most educational. I am grateful for the opportunity to accompany Miss Pembroke to such distinguished gatherings." Educational. Julian pressed gently, intrigued by her choice of words. "That's an interesting way to describe the social whirl. What have you learned?" For the first time since entering the room, Lillian's eyes met his directly, and Julian felt an unexpected jolt at the intelligence he saw there. "I have learned that society is rather like a complex dance, Your Grace. Everyone knows their steps, their place in the formation, and the consequences of moving out of rhythm. It is fascinating to observe the patterns." "And do you dance yourself, Miss Moore?" Julian found himself asking, though he wasn't sure why the answer seemed so important. The flush in her cheeks deepened. Not often, Your Grace. I find I am more comfortable observing than participating." "Oh, but Lillian is an excellent dancer," Arabella interjected with a bright laugh. "She simply lacks confidence. Why, when we practice together, she moves like a dream. She just needs the right partner to bring her out of her shell." Julian noticed how Lillian seemed to shrink further into herself at this well-meaning but embarrassing revelation, her hands clasping tightly in her lap. The protective instinct that had stirred earlier grew stronger, along with an unexpected desire to see her eyes light up with something other than mortification. "Perhaps," he said thoughtfully, "Miss Moore would honor me with a dance at Lady Worthington's ball next week. I find myself curious to see if Miss Pembroke's assessment is accurate." The invitation hung in the air like a challenge, and Julian watched with fascination as a dozen emotions flickered across Lillian's expressive features: surprise, pleasure, terror, and finally a kind of resigned acceptance. If you wish it, Your Grace," she replied quietly. "Though I fear you may find yourself disappointed, I very much doubt that," Julian replied with a warmth that surprised even himself. "I shall look forward to it with great anticipation." The remainder of the visit passed in a blur of conventional pleasantries, but Julian found his attention continually drawn to Lillian. He noticed how she listened with genuine interest when others spoke, how her rare smiles transformed her entire face, how she possessed the gift of asking exactly the right question to draw out the best in her companions. Most intriguingly, he began to see that her quietness was not born of emptiness but of depth. She was someone who thought before she spoke, who observed before she acted, who gave weight to her words because she understood their power. When the time came for their departure, Julian found himself reluctant to see them go. As he handed the ladies into their carriage, his fingers briefly touched Lillian's gloved hand, and he felt an unexpected spark of connection that left him oddly unsettled. "Until next week, Miss Moore," he said as she settled into her seat. "Until next week, Your Grace," she replied, and for just a moment her eyes met his with something that might have been anticipation. As the carriage rolled away down the long drive, Julian stood watching until it disappeared around the bend, his mind already counting the days until Lady Worthington's ball. For the first time in years, he found himself genuinely looking forward to a social engagement, not for the dancing or the conversation or even the excellent champagne, but for the chance to discover more about the quiet young woman who had somehow managed to capture his attention so completely. That evening, as Julian sat in his study with a brandy and the estate ledgers that demanded his attention, he found his thoughts continually drifting back to violet blue eyes and a musical voice that spoke of society as a complex dance. There had been something about Lillian Moore, something beyond her obvious beauty and gentle manner, that had stirred feelings he had thought long dormant. Perhaps it was the way she had listened when he spoke, as if his words truly mattered to her. Perhaps it was the intelligence he had glimpsed beneath her shy exterior, or the kindness she had shown in supporting her more vivacious friend without a trace of jealousy or resentment. Or perhaps it was simply that in a world full of people clamoring for attention, she had been content to remain in the shadows, making her all the more intriguing to a man who had grown weary of constant scrutiny. Whatever the reason, Julian found himself anticipating Lady Worthington's ball with an eagerness that surprised him. For too long, he had moved through society's rituals with the mechanical precision of a man fulfilling his duty. Now, for the first time in years, he felt genuinely curious about what the evening might bring. The dance Lady Worthington's ballroom glittered like a jewel box, its crystal chandeliers casting dancing shadows across walls adorned with silk and gold. The cream of London society had gathered for what promised to be one of the season's most spectacular events, their voices creating a symphony of laughter, gossip, and musical conversation that rose and fell like the tide. Julian stood at the edge of the ballroom, resplendent in midnight blue evening dress that emphasized his dark good looks and commanding height. He had arrived fashionably late, as was his custom, and had spent the better part of an hour fulfilling his social obligations, greeting his hostess, acknowledging various acquaintances, and deflecting the increasingly obvious attempts of ambitious mothers to thrust their daughters into his path. Now, as the orchestra struck up the opening notes of a waltz, he found himself scanning the crowd for a particular chestnut-haired figure in what he hoped would be something more flattering than the modest green dress she had worn to tea. He was not disappointed. When he finally spotted Lillian near the far wall, partially concealed behind a potted palm, as if she were trying to make herself invisible, Julian felt his breath catch in his throat. She wore a gown of deep sapphire silk that brought out the remarkable color of her eyes and complemented her creamy complexion to perfection. The dress was clearly new and of the finest quality, though its design remained characteristically modest, high-necked and long-sleeved, with only the slightest suggestion of the graceful figure beneath. What struck him most forcefully, however, was how utterly miserable she looked. While Arabella held court nearby, surrounded by a circle of admirers who hung on her every word, Lillian stood alone, her hands clasped tightly before her and her gaze fixed on the floor. She looked like a beautiful bird trapped in a cage, longing for escape, but too well-bred to simply flee. Julian made his way across the ballroom with the determined stride of a man on a mission, ignoring the speculative glances and hopeful smiles that followed his progress. When he reached Lillian's side, he was gratified to see her face light up with genuine pleasure at his approach. "Miss Moore," he said, offering her an elegant bow, "you look absolutely radiant this evening. That color is perfection on you." A delicate blush colored her cheeks at the compliment. "Thank you, Your Grace, you are very kind." "I am merely honest," he replied, extending his arm. "Now, I believe you promised me a dance. Shall we see if Miss Pembroke's assessment of your abilities proves accurate?" Lillian hesitated for just a moment, her eyes darting toward the crowded dance floor, where couples whirled in perfect synchronization. "Your Grace, I fear I may have overstated my abilities. Perhaps it would be better if—" "Nonsense," Julian interrupted gently but firmly. "I have been looking forward to this dance all week. You wouldn't disappoint me now, would you?" There was something in his tone, not commanding but quietly persuasive, that made refusal impossible. With a small nod of surrender, Lillian placed her gloved hand on his arm and allowed him to lead her onto the dance floor. As they took their positions for the waltz, Julian was struck by how perfectly she fit against him. She was tall for a woman, which meant he didn't have to bend awkwardly to accommodate her, and when he placed his hand at her waist, he could feel the subtle tension in her frame, not resistance, but nervous energy waiting to be channeled. "Relax," he murmured, as the music began. "Trust me to lead, and simply follow where I take you." For the first few measures, Lillian was stiff and uncertain, her movements careful and calculated, but as Julian's confidence and skill began to communicate themselves through his touch, she gradually began to soften, to trust, to let the music carry her where it would. And then suddenly she was dancing. Not merely moving through the steps, but truly dancing, her body flowing with the rhythm, her feet seeming to barely touch the ground as Julian spun her around the floor. Her earlier nervousness melted away, replaced by a radiant joy that transformed her entire being. Her eyes sparkled with delight, her lips curved in a smile of pure happiness, and Julian found himself mesmerized by the transformation. This was the real Lillian Moore, not the timid wallflower who hid in corners, but a vibrant, passionate woman who had simply never been given the chance to shine. As they moved together in perfect harmony, Julian felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the exertion of dancing and everything to do with the remarkable woman in his arms. "You're magnificent," he said softly, his voice meant for her ears alone. The compliment brought fresh color to her cheeks, but she didn't look away this time. Instead, she met his gaze directly, and Julian saw something there that made his pulse quicken. Not just gratitude, but a spark of genuine attraction that mirrored his own growing feelings. "You make me feel magnificent," she replied, a voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly to him despite the music and chatter around them. As the waltz drew to its close, Julian found himself reluctant to release her. They stood there for a moment longer than strictly proper, their eyes locked, both breathing slightly harder than the dance alone would warrant. Around them, other couples were already moving off the floor, but Julian and Lillian seemed caught in a bubble of their own making. "Miss Moore," Julian began, then stopped, unsure how to put into words what he was feeling. Might I have the honor of calling upon you tomorrow?" The question seemed to break whatever spell had held them, and Lillian's expression shifted from radiant joy to something approaching panic. "Your Grace, you must know that I'm not... my circumstances are quite different from what you might expect." "I care nothing for circumstances," Julian said firmly. "What I care about is the woman I've just danced with, the woman who moves like poetry and speaks like music. May I call upon you?" Before Lillian could answer, Arabella appeared at their side, her face bright with excitement and perhaps just a touch of something that might have been jealousy. "Lillian, that was absolutely divine. Everyone is talking about how beautifully you danced. Your Grace, you've quite transformed our little wallflower into the belle of the ball." The comment, though well-meant, had the effect of reminding Lillian exactly where she stood in the social hierarchy. The confidence that had bloomed during their dance began to wilt, and Julian watched with frustration as she retreated back into herself. "Miss Pembroke is too kind," Lillian murmured, her gaze once again fixed on the floor. "I fear she gives me too much credit." "On the contrary," Julian said, his voice carrying an edge of steel that made both women look at him in surprise. "I believe Miss Pembroke doesn't give you nearly enough credit. You are a remarkable woman, Miss Moore, and anyone who fails to see that is a fool." The vehemence in his tone drew curious glances from nearby guests, and Julian realized he was in danger of creating exactly the kind of scene that would set tongues wagging throughout London. With an effort, he modulated his voice and offered both ladies a polite bow. "I fear I must return you to your chaperone," he said, though his eyes remained fixed on Lillian. "But I hope we shall have occasion to speak again soon." As he escorted them back to Lady Pembroke's side, Julian's mind was already working. He had meant what he said about calling upon Lillian, but he was beginning to realize that conventional courtship might not be the best approach. She was too easily overwhelmed by attention, too quick to retreat into the shadows when the spotlight found her. No, if he wanted to truly know Lillian Moore, and he was surprised by how desperately he did want that, he would need to find a different way. The garden encounter. The morning after Lady Worthington's ball dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of golden autumn light that made even London's sooty streets seem touched with magic. Julian had risen early, unable to sleep for thoughts of violet eyes and the memory of how perfectly Lillian had fitted in his arms during their waltz. He had spent the better part of the night trying to understand what had happened to him on that dance floor. In 31 years of life, he had danced with countless women, debutantes and dowagers, diamonds of the first water, and ambitious climbers, yet none had affected him the way Lillian Moore had. There had been something almost mystical about the way she had transformed in his arms, as if he had been privileged to glimpse her true self beneath the layers of shyness and self-doubt. Now, as he made his way through the streets of Mayfair on horseback, Julian found himself riding past the modest townhouse where he knew the Pembroke family was staying for the season. He told himself he was simply taking his usual morning ride, but when he saw a familiar figure slip through the garden gate of the nearby square, he knew his subconscious had led him here deliberately. Lillian walked alone among the autumn flowers, her steps slow and contemplative. She wore a simple morning dress of pale yellow that made her look like a ray of sunshine against the darker foliage, and her hair was arranged in a loose knot that allowed several tendrils to escape and frame her face. In her hands, she carried a small book, and Julian watched as she settled herself on a secluded bench beneath an ancient oak tree. The sight of her there, so peaceful and unguarded, made something tighten in Julian's chest. This was how she was meant to be, free from the pressures and expectations that seemed to weigh her down in society's drawing rooms. Here, in the quiet sanctuary of the garden, she looked like herself again. Julian dismounted and secured his horse to the garden's iron railing before making his way along the winding path toward her bench. He moved quietly, not wanting to startle her, but she must have sensed his approach because she looked up from her book with an expression of surprise that quickly shifted to something warmer. "Your Grace," she said, starting to rise from the bench. "Please don't get up," Julian said quickly, raising a hand to stop her. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I was riding by and saw you here, and I confess I couldn't resist the opportunity to speak with you away from the crowds." Lillian's cheeks colored prettily, but she didn't look away as she had the previous evening. "I don't mind at all. I often come here in the mornings to read. It's peaceful. May I?" Julian gestured to the empty space beside her on the bench. At her nod, he settled himself next to her, careful to maintain a proper distance while still being close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender that seemed to cling to her hair. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, watching as a pair of sparrows chased each other through the branches overhead. "What are you reading?" Julian asked eventually, nodding toward the book in her lap. Lillian glanced down at the volume as if she had forgotten she was holding it. "Oh, it's nothing very exciting, just some poetry. Lord Byron's latest collection." "Byron?" Julian raised an eyebrow. "That's rather scandalous reading for a young lady, isn't it?" The comment brought a spark of something that might have been defiance to Lillian's eyes. "Perhaps, but I find his work honest. He writes about passion and pain and the complexities of human nature without trying to pretty them up for polite society." Julian found himself smiling at this unexpected glimpse of fire beneath her gentle exterior. "And you appreciate honesty?" "More than almost anything else," Lillian replied, with a conviction that surprised them both. "I'm tired of pretense, Your Grace. Tired of saying what's expected, and behaving as I'm supposed to and pretending that everything is perfectly lovely when it's not." The words seemed to hang in the air between them, and Julian sensed that she had revealed more than she had intended. He leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle when he spoke. "What isn't lovely, Miss Moore? What pretense are you tired of maintaining?" For a moment he thought she might retreat again, might deflect his question with some polite evasion. But then she sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly as if she were setting down a heavy burden. "The pretense that I belong in Arabella's world," she said quietly. "That I'm anything more than a charity case she's taken pity on. Everyone knows it, of course. They're all too polite to say anything directly, but I can see it in their eyes. The poor relation, grateful for whatever scraps of attention she receives." Julian felt a surge of anger on her behalf, but he kept his voice carefully controlled. "Is that how Miss Pembroke treats you? As a charity case?" "Oh, no," Lillian said quickly. "Arabella is wonderful, truly. She's been nothing but kind to me, and I'm grateful for her friendship. It's just—" She trailed off, struggling to find the words. "It's just that kindness isn't the same as equality," Julian finished for her. Lillian's eyes widened in surprise at his understanding. "Yes, exactly. I love Arabella dearly, but I'm always conscious that I'm there by her grace, not by right. I'm the mouse in the corner, grateful to be noticed, but never expecting to be truly seen. And yet I see you," Julian said softly. "Last night when we danced I saw you, not the grateful companion or the charity case, but you, the woman who moves like music and thinks like a poet." The intensity in his voice made Lillian's breath catch. She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to determine whether he was sincere or simply offering the kind of flattery that men of his station were trained to dispense. "Why?" she whispered finally. "Why do you see me when no one else does?" Julian considered the question, knowing that his answer would matter more than any words he had ever spoken. "Because," he said slowly, "I recognize something in you that I've been looking for without even knowing it, a kind of authenticity that's rare in our world. You don't perform, Miss Moore. You simply are. And what you are is extraordinary." Tears gathered in Lillian's eyes at his words, and she looked away, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't name. "You don't know me, Your Grace. You don't know where I come from or what my circumstances truly are." "Then tell me," Julian said simply. "Help me to know you." For a long moment, Lillian was silent, her fingers worrying at the edges of her book. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet he had to lean closer to hear her. "My father was a country vicar," she began. "A good man, but not a wealthy one. When he died 3 years ago, I was left with nothing but a small inheritance that barely covered his debts. Arabella's mother took pity on me, She and my mother had been friends in their youth and offered me a position as Arabella's companion. It's honest work and I'm grateful for it, but it means I exist in a strange sort of limbo. Not quite a servant, but certainly not an equal. Julian absorbed this information without any change in his expression, though inwardly he was processing what it meant. Lillian was essentially penniless, dependent on the charity of others for her very existence. By society's standards, she was utterly unsuitable as a potential wife for a duke. The knowledge should have cooled his interest, should have reminded him of his duty to make an advantageous marriage. Instead, it only made him admire her more. "Thank you for telling me," he said, when she had finished. "It explains a great deal about why you seem so uncomfortable in society's spotlight, but it doesn't change anything about what I see when I look at you." Lillian turned to face him fully, her eyes searching his face. "Doesn't it? Your Grace, you could have any woman in London. Why would you waste your time with someone like me?" "Because," Julian said, reaching out to gently touch her hand where it rested on the bench between them, "I don't want any woman in London. I want the woman who quotes Byron in secret gardens and dances like she was born to fly. I want the woman who speaks truth instead of platitudes and who sees society's dance for what it really is." The touch of his fingers on hers sent a shock of warmth up Lillian's arm, and she found herself unable to look away from his dark eyes. "You speak as if you know me, but we've only just met." "Sometimes," Julian said softly, "the heart recognizes what the mind hasn't yet understood. I knew there was something special about you the moment you spoke of society as a dance. You see things others miss, feel things others ignore. That's not common, Miss Moore, that's precious." Before Lillian could respond, the sound of voices approaching along the garden path made them both turn. A group of fashionable ladies was making their way toward their secluded corner, their bright chatter carrying clearly in the morning air. "I should go," Lillian said quickly, starting to rise from the bench. "If they see us here together, let them see," Julian said, but he made no move to stop her when she stood. "Miss Moore, Lillian, may I call upon you properly? May I speak with Lady Pembroke about my intentions?" The use of her given name sent another thrill through Lillian, but it also brought home the impossibility of what he was suggesting. "Your Grace, you must know that's impossible. Lady Pembroke would never consent to such a thing, and even if she did, society would never accept it." "Society accepts what I tell it to accept," Julian said with quiet confidence. "And as for Lady Pembroke, let me worry about her." The approaching voices were getting closer, and Lillian knew she needed to leave before they were discovered. But she couldn't resist one last look at the man who had somehow managed to see her when she had spent so long being invisible. "I don't understand you, Your Grace," she said softly, "but I would be honored to receive you if Lady Pembroke permits it." With that, she hurried away along a different path, leaving Julian sitting alone on the bench with the scent of lavender lingering in the air and the memory of her words echoing in his mind. As he watched her disappear around a bend in the path, Julian felt a sense of certainty settle over him. He had found what he had been looking for without even knowing he was searching. Now all he had to do was convince the rest of the world that sometimes the most precious treasures were hidden in the most unexpected places. The proposal. Lady Pembroke's drawing room had never seemed quite so intimidating as it did on the afternoon when Julian Ravenswood came to call. The formidable matron sat rigidly upright in her favorite chair, her sharp eyes fixed on the Duke, with an expression that suggested she was trying to determine whether he had taken leave of his senses. "Let me understand you correctly, Your Grace," she said in the tone one might use to address a particularly slow child. "You wish to court Miss Moore, Miss Lillian Moore, my niece's companion." "That is correct," Julian replied calmly, though inwardly he was marshalling all his diplomatic skills for the battle ahead. "I find myself quite taken with the young lady, and would like your permission to pay my addresses to her." Lady Pembroke's eyebrows rose so high they nearly disappeared into her elaborate coiffure. "Your Grace, surely you cannot be serious. Miss Moore is a delightful girl, I grant you, but she is hardly suitable as a potential Duchess. She has no fortune, no connections, no family of any consequence. She is, in short, nobody." The last word hung in the air like a slap, and Julian felt his jaw tighten at the casual dismissal of the woman who had come to occupy so many of his thoughts. "With respect, my lady, I disagree. Miss Moore may lack material advantages, but she possesses qualities far more valuable than gold or connections." "Such as?" Lady Pembroke's tone suggested she found the very idea laughable. "Intelligence, kindness, authenticity," Julian replied without hesitation. "She has a depth of character that is rare in our circles. a genuine warmth that isn't calculated for effect. She sees the world clearly, speaks honestly, and carries herself with a natural grace that no amount of training can instill. Lady Pembroke studied him for a long moment, her expression gradually shifting from incredulity to something approaching concern. "My dear boy, I fear you may be suffering from a temporary infatuation. These things happen, particularly to men of your age who have remained unmarried too long. But surely you must see that such feelings, however intense, are not a sound basis for marriage." "On the contrary," Julian said firmly, "I believe they are the only sound basis for marriage. I have spent years considering the practical aspects of matrimony, and where has it gotten me? Still unmarried at 31, going through the motions of courtship with women who bore me to tears, Miss Moore is the first woman I've met who makes me want to be a better man, who challenges me to think beyond duty and obligation to what might actually bring happiness." "Happiness," Lady Pembroke repeated the word as if it were a foreign concept. "Your Grace, happiness is a luxury that men in your position cannot afford. You have responsibilities to your title, your estates, your family name. You need a wife who can fulfill those responsibilities, not some penniless girl who will be a liability in society." Julian leaned forward in his chair, his dark eyes intense. "And what if I told you that I believe Miss Moore could fulfill those responsibilities better than any diamond of the first water? What if I told you that her very authenticity, her ability to connect with people on a genuine level, would make her a more effective Duchess than someone who merely knows the right forms and says the right things?" "I would say you are deluding yourself," Lady Pembroke replied bluntly. "Your Grace, I have known you since you were a boy, and I care for you deeply. That is why I must speak plainly. This infatuation will pass, but the consequences of acting upon it will not. If you marry beneath your station, you will regret it for the rest of your life." "And if I marry according to your expectations," Julian countered, "I will spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. My lady, I am not a boy to be guided by others' opinions. I am a man of 31 who has finally found something worth fighting for." The passion in his voice seemed to give Lady Pembroke pause. She studied his face carefully, perhaps seeing something there that convinced her of his sincerity. When she spoke again, her tone was slightly less combative. "Very well. Supposing, for the sake of argument, that your feelings are as deep and lasting as you believe them to be, have you considered what this would mean for Miss Moore herself? Do you think she would be happy thrust into a world that will never fully accept her? Do you think she could bear the whispers, the snubs, the constant reminders that she doesn't belong?" It was a shrewd attack, and Julian felt it hit home. He had been so focused on his own feelings, his own certainty that Lillian was what he wanted, that he hadn't fully considered what the marriage would cost her. The thought of her being hurt by society's cruelty made his chest tighten with protective fury. "I would protect her," he said quietly. "I would make sure she was accepted." "You cannot protect her from everything," Lady Pembroke said more gently, "and you cannot force society to accept what it chooses to reject. Oh, they would be polite to her face. They wouldn't dare do otherwise to a duchess. But behind her back, the daughter of a country vicar who married above her station, she would never escape the whispers." Julian was silent for a long moment, wrestling with doubts he didn't want to acknowledge. Was he being selfish in pursuing Lillian? Was he so caught up in his own feelings that he wasn't considering what was best for her? "What would you have me do?" he asked finally. "Forget her? Pretend I never met her? Marry some suitable young lady and spend the rest of my life regretting it?" Lady Pembroke's expression softened slightly at the genuine anguish in his voice. "I would have you think carefully about what you're proposing. If you truly care for Miss Moore, consider whether tying her to a life she's not prepared for is really an act of love." Before Julian could respond, the drawing-room door opened, and Arabella swept in, followed more quietly by Lillian herself. Both young women stopped short when they saw Julian, though their reactions were markedly different. Arabella's face lit up with delight at the unexpected visit from such an eligible caller, while Lillian's expression showed a mixture of pleasure and anxiety that suggested she had some idea of what was being discussed. "Your Grace," Arabella exclaimed, dropping into a perfect curtsy. "What a delightful surprise. Aunt, you didn't tell us we were expecting such distinguished company." "His Grace came to discuss a matter of business," Lady Pembroke said smoothly, though her eyes remained fixed on Julian with a warning expression. "I believe we have concluded our conversation for now." Julian rose from his chair, his gaze moving immediately to Lillian, who stood slightly behind her friend as usual. She wore a simple dress of soft blue that brought out her eyes, and her hair was arranged in the loose style he had come to prefer. Just looking at her made his heart race, and he knew with absolute certainty that no amount of practical argument would change his mind. "Miss Pembroke, Miss Moore," he said, offering both ladies a bow. "How lovely to see you both again." "The pleasure is ours, Your Grace," Arabella replied, though she glanced curiously between Julian and her aunt, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't understand. Lillian said nothing, but her eyes met Julian's for just a moment, and in that brief contact he saw a question that made his chest tighten. She knew, somehow she knew what he had come here to discuss, and she was waiting to learn her fate. "I was just leaving," Julian said, though every instinct urged him to stay, to fight for what he wanted. "But I hope I may call again soon." "Of course, Your Grace," Lady Pembroke replied with perfect politeness that didn't quite mask the steel beneath. "You are always welcome in this house." As Julian made his farewells and prepared to leave, he caught Lillian's eye one more time. In that look, he tried to convey everything he couldn't say aloud, that his feelings hadn't changed, that he wasn't giving up, that somehow he would find a way to make this work. Whether she understood his silent message, he couldn't tell. But as he left the Pembroke house and made his way back to his own residence, Julian's mind was already working on a new strategy. Lady Pembroke had raised valid concerns, but she had also revealed something important. She wasn't entirely opposed to the match, merely convinced it was impractical. If he could prove that Lillian could succeed in his world, if he could show that she had the strength and grace to be a duchess, perhaps he could change the formidable matron's mind. And if he could win Lady Pembroke's support, the rest of society would follow. The question was how to give Lillian the chance to prove herself without putting her in a position where failure would destroy her confidence forever. It would require careful planning, delicate maneuvering, and perhaps a bit of luck. But Julian had not become one of the most influential men in England by backing down from challenges. If anything, Lady Pembroke's opposition had only strengthened his resolve. He would find a way to make this work, not just for his own happiness, but for Lillian's as well. After all, some things were worth fighting for, and Lillian Moore was definitely one of them. 3 days after his conversation with Lady Pembroke, Julian found himself pacing the length of his study, like a caged tiger. The interview had not gone as badly as it might have, but neither had it achieved the result he desired. Lady Pembroke's concerns, much as he hated to admit it, were not entirely without merit. Society could be cruel to those who stepped outside its rigid boundaries, and the thought of Lillian bearing the brunt of that cruelty made his blood boil. But there had to be a way. There had to be some means of proving that Lillian possessed not just the beauty and grace to be a duchess, but the strength and intelligence to thrive in that role. As he contemplated various strategies, a knock at his study door interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called, and was surprised to see his butler, Hartwell, accompanied by a familiar figure. "Your Grace," Hartwell announced with his usual dignity, "Lady Pembroke to see you." Julian's eyebrows rose in surprise. He had expected to wait at least a week before Lady Pembroke would consent to see him again, and he certainly hadn't expected her to come to him. As she swept into his study with her characteristic authority, he noticed that her expression was thoughtful rather than hostile, a promising development. "Your Grace," she said, accepting his offer of a chair with regal grace. "I hope you will forgive the informality of this visit, but I have been thinking a great deal about our conversation the other day." "As have I," Julian replied, settling into the chair across from her. "I hope you have not come to deliver an ultimatum." Lady Pembroke's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. "Nothing so dramatic. Rather, I have come with a proposition. You see, I have been observing Miss Moore more closely since our discussion, and I must admit that some of your observations about her character have merit." Julian felt a surge of hope, but kept his expression carefully neutral. "Indeed, indeed. She is intelligent, well-read, and possesses a natural dignity that is quite remarkable given her circumstances. She also has a way with people. The servants adore her, and even the most difficult of my acquaintances seem to soften in her presence. These are not inconsiderable qualities in a potential duchess. I am gratified that you see what I see in her," Julian said carefully. "However," Lady Pembroke continued, raising a hand to forestall his enthusiasm, "seeing potential and proving it can be realized are two very different things, which brings me to my proposition." Julian leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "I'm listening." "Next week, I'm hosting my annual autumn house party at Pembroke Manor. It is traditionally a gathering of the most influential members of society, politicians, diplomats, literary figures, and their families. The conversation is sophisticated, the expectations are high, and the social dynamics are complex. It sounds formidable, Julian observed. It is intended to be. Now normally Miss Moore would attend as Arabella's companion, helping with correspondence, and remaining largely in the background. But what if, instead, she were to attend as an honored guest? What if she were to be thrust into the center of society's most demanding social situation and given the chance to prove herself? Julian's pulse quickened as he began to understand where this was leading. Are you suggesting a test? Precisely. If Miss Moore can navigate a week at Pembroke Manor, if she can hold her own in conversation with some of the most brilliant minds in England, if she can demonstrate the poise and grace necessary to be a Duchess, then I will withdraw my objections to your suit. And if she cannot, Lady Pembroke's expression grew stern, then you will agree that the match is unsuitable and cease your pursuit of her. Julian was quiet for a long moment, weighing the proposal. It was risky. If Lillian failed, he would lose her forever. But it was also an opportunity to prove once and for all that she belonged in his world. What does Miss Moore think of this plan? He asked. She doesn't know of it yet. I wanted to discuss it with you first, but I believe she would agree. She has more courage than she gives herself credit for. And the other guests? They would know nothing of the true purpose behind her elevated status. Nothing at all. As far as they would know, Miss Moore is a young lady of good family whom I have decided to sponsor for the season. Her background would remain vague, her circumstances unspecified. Julian stood and moved to the window, staring out at the bustling street below as he considered the proposal. It was a gamble, but perhaps it was the only way to move forward. And if Lillian succeeded, when she succeeded, he corrected himself, it would silence any future objections to their marriage. Very well, he said, turning back to Lady Pembroke. I accept your terms, but I have one condition of my own, which is, if Miss Moore agrees to this test, I want to be present to support her. Not openly, of course. I wouldn't want to give her an unfair advantage, but I want to be there. Lady Pembroke considered this for a moment, then nodded. That can be arranged. You were already on my guest list after all. Very well, Your Grace, we have an agreement. As she rose to leave, Julian felt compelled to ask one more question. My lady, may I ask what changed your mind? What made you willing to give Miss Moore this chance? Lady Pembroke paused at the door, her expression thoughtful. Yesterday I watched her comfort one of my kitchen maids who had received bad news from home. Miss Moore didn't just offer sympathy. She sat with the girl, listened to her troubles, and helped her compose a letter to her family. She did it without thought of reward or recognition, simply because it was the right thing to do. She met Julian's eyes directly. That kind of genuine compassion cannot be taught, Your Grace. If she possesses that quality, perhaps she possesses others that would serve her well as a Duchess. We shall soon find out. Chapter 5. The House Party. Pembroke Manor rose from the Hertfordshire countryside like something from a fairy tale, its golden stone walls glowing in the afternoon sun as carriages wound their way up the long drive. The house had been in the Pembroke family for 3 centuries, and every generation had added their own touches to its grandeur. Now, as the season's most exclusive house party prepared to begin, it looked every inch the setting for high society's most sophisticated gathering. Lillian stood at the window of the elegant guest chamber she had been assigned, watching as yet another impressive carriage disgorged its fashionably dressed occupants onto the front steps. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the skirts of her new gown, a creation of deep emerald silk that Lady Pembroke had insisted upon purchasing for the occasion. The past week had been a whirlwind of preparation that still left Lillian feeling as though she were living in someone else's life. Lady Pembroke's announcement that she would be attending the house party as an honored guest, rather than Arabella's companion, had been shocking enough, but the subsequent days of fittings, lessons in protocol, and intensive coaching on current events and social topics had left her head spinning. You look beautiful, Arabella said from behind her, and Lillian turned to see her friend approaching with a warm smile. That color is perfect on you. I feel like an imposter, Lillian confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Arabella, what if I make a fool of myself? What if everyone sees through this charade? Arabella took her hands, squeezing them gently. Listen to me, Lillian Moore. You are not an imposter. You are one of the most intelligent, well-read, and genuinely kind people I know. These guests may have titles and fortunes, but that doesn't make them better than you. But they'll expect me to know things, to understand references, to move in their world as if I belong there. And you will, Arabella said firmly. Do you think Lord Pemberton became a respected diplomat because of his birth, or that Lady Ashworth earned her reputation as a literary salon hostess through her family connections. Many of our most accomplished guests have succeeded through merit, not just breeding. You have merit, Lillian, more than most. A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation, and Lady Pembroke entered, resplendent in burgundy silk and diamonds. Her sharp eyes took in Lillian's appearance with evident approval. "Excellent," she pronounced. "You look every inch the lady of quality. Are you ready to join our other guests for tea?" Lillian's stomach clenched with nerves, but she nodded. "As ready as I can be, my lady." "Remember what we discussed," Lady Pembroke said as they made their way downstairs. "Listen more than you speak, ask thoughtful questions, and don't be afraid to express your opinions when you have them. These people respect intelligence and authenticity above all else." The drawing room was already filled with guests when they arrived, and Lillian felt a moment of panic as dozens of eyes turned toward her. But Lady Pembroke's hand on her arm was steady and reassuring as she began the introductions. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to meet Miss Lillian Moore, a dear friend of the family. Miss Moore, may I present Lord and Lady Ashworth, Sir Thomas Pemberton, Mrs. Whitmore." The names and faces blurred together as Lillian made her curtsies and murmured appropriate responses. But gradually, as the initial flurry of introductions died down and conversation resumed, she began to relax slightly. These were, after all, simply people. Accomplished and influential people, certainly, but people nonetheless. "Miss Moore," came a cultured voice at her elbow, and she turned to find a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes. "I am Lord Pemberton. Lady Pembroke tells me you are interested in literature." "Yes, my lord," Lillian replied, grateful for a topic she felt confident discussing. "I find it fascinating how authors can illuminate the human condition through their work." "Indeed. And what authors do you particularly admire?" "I have great appreciation for Miss Austen's wit and social observation," Lillian said, her nervousness beginning to fade as she warmed to the subject. "But I must confess a particular fondness for the romantic poets. Byron, Shelley, Wordsworth. There's something about their passion and idealism that speaks to me." Lord Pemberton's eyebrows rose with interest. "Byron? That's rather bold reading for a young lady." Lillian felt a flush of heat in her cheeks but didn't back down. "Perhaps, my lord. But I believe that literature should challenge us, should make us think and feel more deeply. Byron may be scandalous, but his work contains profound truths about human nature." "Well said," came another voice, and Lillian turned to see a woman of middle years with intelligent dark eyes. "I am Lady Ashworth, and I quite agree with your assessment. Too many young ladies are content to read only what is deemed appropriate, without considering whether it has anything meaningful to say." "Thank you, my lady," Lillian said, feeling a surge of confidence. "I believe we do ourselves a disservice when we limit our reading to only what is comfortable or conventional." "Exactly so," Lady Ashworth agreed. "Tell me, what did you think of Shelley's latest work?" "I found his treatment of political themes quite provocative." As Lillian found herself drawn into an animated discussion of literature and politics, she gradually became aware that other conversations around the room had quieted slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to suggest that people were listening to what she had to say. The realization might have made her nervous, but instead it energized her. These were the kinds of conversations she had always longed to have, discussions of ideas and ideals rather than gossip and fashion. From across the room, Julian watched with growing admiration as Lillian held her own among some of London's most sophisticated conversationalists. She had been nervous at first. He could see it in the slight tension of her shoulders, the careful way she chose her words. But as the discussion progressed, she had relaxed into herself, becoming the intelligent, passionate woman he had glimpsed in their private moments. "She's doing well," came a quiet voice beside him, and he turned to see Lady Pembroke approaching with 2 cups of tea. "Better than well," Julian replied, accepting the cup gratefully. "She's magnificent." "Indeed, Lord Pemberton is quite taken with her. He's been monopolizing her attention for the past quarter hour, and Lady Ashworth has already invited her to attend her next literary salon." Julian felt a surge of pride and something deeper, a fierce protectiveness that made him want to cross the room and claim Lillian as his own. But he forced himself to remain where he was. This was her moment to shine, and he wouldn't risk overshadowing her success. "The evening will be the real test," Lady Pembroke continued. "Dinner conversation is more formal, more demanding. And there will be cards afterward, which requires a different kind of social skill entirely." "She'll manage," Julian said with quiet confidence. "She's stronger than she knows." As if sensing his gaze, Lillian looked up from her conversation and met his eyes across the room. For just a moment, the bustling drawing room seemed to fade away, and there was only the two of them, connected by an invisible thread of understanding and support. Then Lady Ashworth asked her another question, and the moment passed, but the warmth of that brief connection stayed with Julian for the rest of the afternoon. The dinner that evening was indeed a more formal affair, with guests seated according to strict protocol and conversation flowing in the elaborate patterns that high society had perfected over centuries. Lillian found herself seated between Sir Thomas Pemberton, a noted diplomat, and Mr. Whitmore, a member of Parliament known for his progressive views. "Miss Moore," Sir Thomas said as the first course was served, "Lady Pembroke tells me you have some interesting perspectives on current events. What do you make of the recent developments in Parliament regarding the poor laws?" It was exactly the kind of question Lillian had been dreading, political, complex, and requiring knowledge she wasn't sure she possessed. But as she considered her response, she realized that she did have opinions on the subject, formed through her own experiences and observations. "I believe, Sir Thomas, that any discussion of the poor laws must begin with an understanding of what poverty actually means," she said carefully. "Too often, I think, we speak of the poor as if they were a different species entirely, rather than people who have simply been less fortunate in their circumstances." "An interesting point," Mr. Whitmore interjected, "but surely you would agree that some distinction must be made between the deserving and undeserving poor." Lillian felt a flash of something that might have been anger, but she kept her voice level. "I would question, sir, who has the right to make such distinctions. In my experience, poverty is rarely a matter of moral failing, but rather of circumstance. Illness, death of a breadwinner, economic downturns that affect entire regions." "Why you speak as if you have personal knowledge of such circumstances," Sir Thomas observed, and Lillian realized she had revealed more than she intended. "I have been fortunate in my own life," she said carefully, "but I have not been blind to the struggles of others. I believe it is our duty as Christians and as human beings to offer assistance without judgment." "Admirable sentiment," Mr. Whitmore said, though his tone suggested he found her views somewhat naive. "But surely you must see that unlimited charity only encourages dependence." "I would argue, sir, that what we call charity is often simply justice delayed. When we live in a society that allows some to accumulate vast wealth while others starve, perhaps the question is not whether the poor deserve our help, but whether we deserve our privileges." The comment was bolder than anything Lillian had intended to say, and she felt a moment of panic. A silence fell around their section of the table. Had she gone too far? Had she revealed too much of her own circumstances and sympathies? But then Sir Thomas began to chuckle, and the tension broke. "My dear Miss Moore, you argue like a philosopher. I find myself quite impressed by your reasoning, even if I don't entirely agree with your conclusions." "As do I," Mr. Whitmore added, though he looked somewhat bemused. "You have given me much to think about." As conversation resumed around the table, Lillian felt a surge of accomplishment. She had not only survived the political discussion, but had actually contributed something meaningful to it. Perhaps she did belong in this world after all. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of card games, musical performances, and the kind of sophisticated conversation that Lillian was beginning to realize she not only could navigate, but actually enjoyed. When the party finally began to break up near midnight, she felt exhausted but exhilarated. "Well done," Lady Pembroke murmured as they made their way upstairs. "You have exceeded my expectations." "Thank you, my lady," Lillian replied, though she was still processing everything that had happened. "I feel as though I've been living someone else's life today." "No, my dear," Lady Pembroke said with a smile that was warmer than any Lillian had ever seen from her. "I think perhaps you've been living your own life for the first time." As Lillian prepared for bed that night, she found herself thinking not just about the day's successes, but about the man whose dark eyes had watched her with such pride and encouragement. Julian had been there, a steady presence in the background, never interfering but always supportive. The knowledge that he believed in her had given her strength when her own confidence faltered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, but tonight, for the first time in her life, Lillian Moore felt like she might actually be worthy of the extraordinary man who had seen something special in her when no one else had bothered to look. The revelation. The second day of the house party dawned grey and drizzly, the kind of weather that drove guests indoors and created an atmosphere of intimate conversation and quiet pursuits. Lillian woke feeling more confident than she had the previous morning, buoyed by her successes at dinner and the warm reception she had received from the other guests. She dressed carefully in a morning gown of soft lavender that Lady Pembroke had selected for her, and made her way downstairs to find the breakfast room already buzzing with conversation. Several of the ladies were discussing plans for the day, while the gentlemen debated the merits of various political reforms over their coffee and newspapers. "Miss Moore," Lady Ashworth called out as Lillian entered. "Perfect timing. We were just discussing the possibility of organizing some theatrical entertainment for this evening. Lady Pembroke mentioned that you have some experience with dramatic literature." "Some, my lady," Lillian replied, taking the seat that was offered to her, "though I fear my experience is more as a reader than a performer." "Nonsense," declared Mrs. Whitmore, a vivacious woman with greying curls and a theatrical manner. "Reading is the foundation of all good performance. Tell me, what plays do you know well?" As Lillian found herself drawn into an animated discussion of Shakespeare, Sheridan, and the latest theatrical offerings in London, she began to relax into the easy camaraderie that seemed to characterize this gathering. These people, she realized, were not the cold, judgmental aristocrats she had feared. They were intelligent, cultured individuals who valued wit and conversation above birth and fortune. "I have an idea," announced Lady Ashworth suddenly. "Why don't we organize a series of dramatic readings? Nothing too elaborate, just selections from various works that showcase different styles and periods. Miss Moore, would you be willing to participate?" Lillian felt a flutter of nerves but found herself nodding. "I would be honored, my lady." "Excellent. We could do scenes from Shakespeare, perhaps some of the newer romantic poetry. Oh, this will be delightful." As the ladies began planning their impromptu entertainment, Lillian caught sight of Julian entering the breakfast room. He looked handsome as always in his morning dress, but there was something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. When their eyes met across the room, she saw warmth and pride there, but also something deeper, an intensity that made her breath catch. The morning passed quickly in a flurry of preparation for the evening's entertainment. Lillian found herself assigned several pieces to read, including a sonnet by Shakespeare and a selection from Byron's latest work. As she practiced in the quiet of the library, she became aware that she was no longer alone. "You have a beautiful reading voice," Julian said softly from the doorway. Lillian looked up from her book, feeling her cheeks warm at the compliment. "Your Grace, I didn't hear you come in. I didn't want to interrupt. You were quite absorbed in the verse." He moved closer, and Lillian was struck again by how his presence seemed to fill any room he entered. "Byron again, I see." "Lady Ashworth selected it," Lillian said, then added with a small smile, "though I confess I would have chosen it myself. There's something about his passion that speaks to me." "Passion," Julian repeated, his voice dropping to a lower register that made Lillian's pulse flutter. "Yes, I can see how that would appeal to you." There was something in his tone that made Lillian look at him more closely. They were alone in the library, she realized, with the door partially closed and the rest of the house occupied with their own pursuits. The intimacy of the moment was both thrilling and terrifying. "Your Grace," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the questions that had been building in her mind since the house party began. "Julian," he corrected gently. "When we're alone, I would like you to call me Julian." The use of his given name felt dangerous, intimate in a way that made Lillian's heart race. "Julian," she said softly, testing the sound of it, "I must ask, why are you here? I mean truly here. This house party, my sudden elevation to honored guest, it's all connected to you somehow, isn't it?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "You're very perceptive." "Yes, it's connected to me. Lady Pembroke and I have an understanding." "What kind of understanding?" Julian moved closer, close enough that she could catch the scent of his cologne, see the fine lines around his dark eyes. "The kind that determines whether I'll be allowed to court you properly." Lillian's breath caught. "Court me? But Julian, that's impossible. You know what I am, where I come from." "I know exactly what you are," he said firmly. "You're intelligent, kind, beautiful, and stronger than you give yourself credit for. You're everything I want in a wife." "A wife?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "Yes, a wife. My wife, if you'll have me." Julian reached out to touch her hand where it rested on the book. "Lillian, I've been half in love with you since that first afternoon at tea, and completely in love with you since our dance at Lady Worthington's ball. This house party is Lady Pembroke's test. If you can prove yourself here, among society's most demanding critics, she'll withdraw her objections to our marriage." Lillian stared at him, her mind reeling. "You're in love with me?" "Desperately," Julian confirmed, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her hand. "I know it seems sudden. I know the circumstances are complicated, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. But Julian, even if Lady Pembroke approves, society will never accept it. A duke and a penniless companion, the scandal would be enormous. Let them scandal, Julian said with quiet intensity. I've spent my entire life doing what was expected of me, marrying who I was supposed to marry, living according to other people's rules. For once, I want to choose for myself, and I choose you. Lillian felt tears gathering in her eyes at the passion in his voice. You don't understand what you're asking. If you marry me, you'll be giving up so much. Social standing, advantageous connections, the respect of your peers, and gaining everything that truly matters, Julian countered. Love, partnership, happiness. Lillian, I've met every eligible young lady in London, and not one of them has made me feel what you make me feel. Not one of them has challenged me to be better, made me laugh, made me want to be worthy of their regard. What do I make you feel? Lillian asked softly. Julian's eyes darkened as he moved even closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. Alive, he said simply. For the first time in years, you make me feel truly alive. The intensity of the moment was broken by the sound of voices in the corridor outside, and they sprang apart just as the library door opened fully to admit Lady Ashworth and Mrs. Whitmore. Oh! Lady Ashworth exclaimed, taking in the scene with sharp eyes. I do apologize, we were looking for Miss Moore to discuss this evening's program. Of course, Lillian said, her voice slightly breathless. I was just practicing. And His Grace was offering his expertise, Julian added smoothly, though Lillian could see the tension in his jaw. I'll leave you ladies to your preparations. As he left the library, Julian caught Lillian's eye one more time, and in that look she saw a promise that their conversation was far from over. The rest of the day passed in a haze of preparation and nervous anticipation. Lillian found it difficult to concentrate on the evening's entertainment when her mind kept returning to Julian's declaration. He loved her. He wanted to marry her. The knowledge was both thrilling and terrifying. As evening approached and guests began gathering in the drawing room for the theatrical entertainment, Lillian felt her nerves building. This was more than just a performance. It was another test, another opportunity to prove herself worthy of the extraordinary future Julian was offering her. You look pale, my dear, Lady Pembroke observed as they prepared to begin. Are you feeling quite well? Just nervous, my lady, Lillian admitted. Don't be. You've already proven yourself admirably. Tonight is simply an opportunity to shine. As the evening's entertainment began, Lillian watched the other performers with growing appreciation for their skill and confidence. When her turn came to read the Shakespeare sonnet, she stood before the assembled guests with her heart pounding, acutely aware of Julian's presence in the audience. But as she began to speak the familiar words, something magical happened. The nervousness fell away, replaced by the pure joy of sharing beautiful language with people who could appreciate it. Her voice grew stronger, more confident, and she found herself truly inhabiting the emotion of the verse. When she finished, the applause was warm and genuine, and she saw approval in the faces around her. But it was Julian's expression that mattered most. The pride and love shining in his dark eyes made her feel as though she could conquer the world. The evening continued with more readings, some musical performances, and animated discussion of the various pieces. Lillian found herself at the center of several conversations, her opinions sought and valued by people she had been intimidated by just days before. As the party finally began to wind down near midnight, Lady Pembroke approached her with an expression that was difficult to read. Miss Moore, might I have a word with you in private? Lillian's heart sank. Had she done something wrong? Had Lady Pembroke seen through her performance to the frightened girl beneath? They made their way to a small sitting room off the main drawing room, and Lady Pembroke closed the door behind them. For a long moment she studied Lillian's face in silence. You've surprised me, she said finally. I hope not unpleasantly, my lady. On the contrary, when I proposed this test to His Grace, I expected you to fail. I thought you would be overwhelmed by the company, intimidated by the conversation, revealed as the simple country girl I believed you to be. Lillian felt her heart sink further. And instead, I find myself looking at a young woman who has not only held her own among some of the most sophisticated people in England, but has actually enhanced their company. Lord Pemberton told me this evening that your insights on political reform were among the most thoughtful he's heard in years. Lady Ashworth has invited you to her salon, an honor she extends to very few. Even Mrs. Whitmore, who is notoriously difficult to please, has pronounced you delightfully refreshing. Lillian stared at her, hardly daring to hope. Does this mean? It means, my dear girl, that I have been forced to revise my opinion of you entirely. You have proven that breeding and fortune are not the only measures of worth, that intelligence and character can indeed triumph over circumstance. Lady Pembroke moved closer, her expression growing warmer than Lillian had ever seen it. It means that when His Grace asks for my blessing on your marriage, I will give it gladly. Lillian felt tears spilling down her cheeks as the full import of Lady Pembroke's words sank in. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for giving me this chance. Thank you for proving me wrong," Lady Pembroke replied with a smile. "It's not often I'm forced to admit error, but in this case, I'm delighted to do so." As they made their way back to rejoin the other guests, Lillian caught sight of Julian waiting in the corridor. One look at her face told him everything he needed to know, and his own expression transformed with joy and relief. "Well?" he asked softly, as Lady Pembroke tactfully moved ahead. "She approves," Lillian said, her voice still thick with tears. "She's going to give us her blessing." Julian's response was immediate and overwhelming. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around in a gesture of pure jubilation that made her laugh despite her tears. "Marry me," he said, as he set her down, his hands framing her face. "Say you'll marry me, Lillian. Say you'll be my Duchess, my partner, my love." Looking into his dark eyes, seeing the love and hope and absolute certainty there, Lillian felt the last of her doubts melt away. This extraordinary man loved her, not despite her humble origins, but because of who she was, and she loved him with an intensity that still took her breath away. "Yes," she whispered, then louder with growing confidence. "Yes, Julian, I'll marry you." His kiss was gentle at first, then deeper, as she responded with all the love and passion she had been holding back. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless and radiant with happiness. "I love you," Julian said softly. "I love your mind, your heart, your courage, your beautiful soul. I love everything about you, and I love you," Lillian replied, marveling at how right the words felt. "I love your strength, your kindness, your vision of what we could be together. I love that you saw me when I was invisible to everyone else." As they stood there in the corridor holding each other and planning their future, Lillian reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. A week ago, she had been a nobody, a poor companion, grateful for whatever scraps of attention came her way. Now she was engaged to a duke, accepted by society's elite and, more importantly, deeply loved by a man who valued her for exactly who she was. It was, she thought, rather like something from one of the novels she loved to read, except this was real, and it was hers, and it was just the beginning of what promised to be the most extraordinary love story of all. 6 months later, the wedding of the Duke of Ravenswood to Miss Lillian Moore was declared by all who attended to be the event of the season. St. George's, Hanover Square, had never looked more magnificent, bedecked with white roses and trailing ivy that transformed the ancient church into something from a fairy tale. The cream of society filled every pew, their whispered conversations creating a symphony of anticipation and approval. Lillian stood at the back of the church, her hand resting lightly on Lord Pemberton's arm. Lady Pembroke had arranged for the distinguished diplomat to give her away, declaring that such an extraordinary bride deserved an escort worthy of the occasion. Her wedding gown was a masterpiece of ivory silk and Brussels lace, its elegant simplicity perfectly suited to her natural grace. But it was not the grandeur of the setting or the magnificence of her dress that made Lillian's heart race as the organ began to play. It was the sight of Julian waiting for her at the altar, resplendent in his formal dress, his dark eyes fixed on her with such love and pride that she felt as though she could float down the aisle. As she began her walk toward him, Lillian reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. The month since their engagement had been a whirlwind of preparation, not just for the wedding, but for her new role as a Duchess. Lady Pembroke had taken her education in hand with characteristic efficiency, ensuring that she was prepared for every aspect of her future responsibilities. But more than that, Lillian had discovered that her success at the house party had not been a fluke. She genuinely enjoyed the intellectual stimulation of high society, the political discussions, the literary salons, the opportunity to use her mind and voice in service of causes she believed in. She had found her place in Julian's world, not by changing who she was, but by finally being allowed to be herself. When she reached the altar and Julian took her hand, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. There was only the two of them, making vows that would bind them together for life, promising to love and honor each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. "I love you," Julian whispered as they were pronounced husband and wife, his voice thick with emotion. "And I love you," Lillian replied, her heart so full of joy she thought it might burst. Their kiss was gentle, reverent, a promise of all the passion and partnership that lay ahead. When they turned to face their guests as the new Duke and Duchess of Ravenswood, the applause was thunderous, but Lillian barely heard it. She was too busy marveling at the extraordinary turn her life had taken. The reception that followed was a glittering affair, held at Ravenswood House, which had been transformed for the occasion. Lillian moved through the receiving line with growing confidence, accepting congratulations and good wishes from people who had once looked through her as if she didn't exist. "You look radiant, my dear," Lady Ashworth said as she approached with her characteristic warmth. "Marriage clearly suits you." "Thank you, my lady. I feel complete, I suppose, as if I finally found where I belong." "And where you belong is wherever you choose to make your place," Lady Ashworth replied with a knowing smile. "You've proven that quite thoroughly." As the evening progressed, Lillian found herself surrounded by friends, for that's what they had become, these people who had once intimidated her so thoroughly. Lord Pemberton regaled her with amusing stories from his diplomatic career. Mrs. Whitmore insisted on discussing plans for a charity she wanted Lillian to patron, and even the most formidable dowagers seemed to have accepted her completely. "Penny for your thoughts," Julian said, appearing at her side with 2 glasses of champagne. "I was just thinking about how different everything is from what I expected," Lillian replied, accepting the glass gratefully. "6 months ago I thought happiness was something that happened to other people. Now I feel like the luckiest woman in the world." Julian's smile was radiant. "That's fortunate, because I happen to be the luckiest man. Though I prefer to think it's not luck at all, I prefer to think we found each other because we were meant to." "Do you really believe that? In fate, I mean?" "I believe in us," Julian replied simply. "I believe that sometimes, if we're very fortunate, we find the person who makes us complete. You make me complete, Lillian. You make me better than I ever thought I could be." As they stood there together, surrounded by the warmth and celebration of their wedding reception, Lillian felt a profound sense of gratitude for the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them together. She had been nobody, a gentle, shy girl who had learned to make herself invisible, but Julian had seen her, truly seen her, and in doing so had given her the courage to become who she was always meant to be. "What are you thinking about now?" Julian asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "About being nobody," Lillian said with a smile. "About how sometimes being nobody is exactly what you need to be in order to become somebody extraordinary." Julian raised his glass in a toast. "To my extraordinary wife, who was never nobody to me, and to my remarkable husband, who gave me the life of my dreams." As they touched their glasses together, Lillian knew that this was just the beginning of their story. There would be challenges ahead, certainly, the responsibilities of their position, the demands of society, the ordinary trials that all marriages face, but they would face them together, as partners in every sense of the word. And if anyone ever doubted that a gentle, shy girl could become a duchess, that true love could triumph over social expectations, that sometimes the most precious treasures were found in the most unexpected places, well, they need only look at the Duke and Duchess of Ravenswood to see that fairy tales occasionally did come true. In this tale of transformation and true love, we see how genuine worth transcends social boundaries, how love can give us the courage to become our best selves, and how sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the wisdom to recognize their true value. Lillian's journey from invisible companion to beloved Duchess reminds us that nobility of character matters far more than nobility of birth, and that when we are truly seen and valued for who we are, we can accomplish extraordinary things.